I woke up the morning after a major winter storm expecting the usual aftermath. Plowed streets, snow-covered yards, the typical post-storm routine. What I actually found was something else entirely. A mountain of snow ran nearly the full length of my property line. My first assumption was wind drift. The tire track said otherwise. Someone had deliberately driven truckloads of snow onto my land overnight and dumped it there methodically, like it was a designated storage site instead of private property. Walking the boundary made the situation unmistakable. The HOA had cleared their own roads and used my pasture as the dumping ground. The piles were massive, blocking part of my field, burying equipment I'd store for the winter. This wasn't an accident. It was a decision, and I already had a pretty good idea who'd made it. The next morning, HOA Karen showed up with her usual unshakable confidence. According to her, the neighborhood simply had nowhere else to put the snow, and everyone needed to make occasional sacrifices for the community's sake. When I asked who had actually authorized dumping it on private property she didn't control, she brushed the question off and told me not to make this into a problem. So I went inside and pulled my property records instead. The boundary markers were clean and unambiguous. The snow sat several feet inside my legal property line. No easement covered it. No agreement existed. The HOA had zero authority over that section of land. None whatsoever. If rules were the framework everyone wanted to operate under, I had no objection to playing by them. Over the next 2 days, I quietly worked out a plan. I hired equipment, and my crew began relocating every bit of snow that had been dumped on my land. Not off the property, but to a narrow strip running alongside a shortcut road that HOA residents use constantly. That strip was entirely mine. The snow stayed on my side of the line the entire time. By the end of the week, a substantial snow barrier stood beside that roadway. I hadn't damaged anything. I hadn't crossed onto HOA property. I had simply reorganized snow that legally belonged on my land in the first place. The effect on the shortcut, however, was immediate. Residents trying to use that route suddenly found it impassable. Cars turned around. Delivery drivers rerouted onto longer roads. Confused homeowners started asking why their usual shortcut had disappeared overnight. It didn't take long for Karen to show up, furious, demanding I remove the barrier immediately. I handed her copies of the exact same property documents she'd dismissed days earlier. The snow was on my land. The barrier was on my land. Every step I'd taken was completely within my legal rights. For the first time in this entire situation, she didn't have a quick comeback. Word moved through the neighborhood fast. People who'd only heard Karen's version of events started asking pointed questions. Why had the HOA dumped snow on private property without permission? Why hadn't anyone asked first? And increasingly, what exactly were residents paying HOA dues for if basic snow removal couldn't be handled within the HOA's own boundaries? The board called an emergency meeting, presumably hoping to control the story before it spiraled further. Karen stood in front of the crowd and tried to frame me as the unreasonable party. I had photographs, dates, property maps. Each piece of evidence dismantled her version a little more thoroughly than the last. The room's energy flipped almost instantly. Instead of questioning my decision to relocate the snow, neighbors started questioning the board's decision to dump it in the first place. Several residents admitted they'd personally watched trucks pushing snow toward my property during the storm cleanup. Others started wondering out loud whether this kind of overreach had happened before without anyone noticing or saying anything. Karen's composure didn't survive the meeting intact. The board member seated beside her looked increasingly uncomfortable as what started as a simple property complaint turned into a public conversation about accountability they clearly hadn't anticipated. The snow barrier, meanwhile, stayed exactly where it was. The HOA brought in attorneys, dug through every record they could find, and searched for any rule that might force its removal. They found nothing. Every legal path led to the same conclusion. The HOA had created this entire situation themselves, and there was no rule that obligated me to clean up their mistake on their timeline. Days later, the snow removal contractor met with HOA representatives directly after reviewing everything. Even he acknowledged the dumping operation shouldn't have happened the way it did. He'd been following HOA instructions and had assumed proper permission was already secured. It hadn't been. Nobody had checked. As winter continued, something shifted in the neighborhood beyond just the snow itself. Neighbors who'd barely interacted before started talking through HOA decisions more carefully. Meeting attendance went up. People started actually reading the documents the board distributed. The kind of automatic trust that lets a board operate without much scrutiny started eroding, replaced by something healthier. Residents who paid attention. Karen eventually addressed the community again, this time with noticeably different tone. She acknowledged that mistakes had been made and committed to keeping future snow removal strictly within approved boundaries. It wasn't the dramatic, fully accountable apology some residents wanted, but it was enough to signal the message had actually landed. By spring, the snow melted, the piles disappeared, and the roads reopened. Life moved on, but the story stuck around as a neighborhood favorite. Not because of the snow itself, but because of what it revealed. The HOA had assumed they could use someone else's property without consequence, confident nobody would push back hard enough to matter. Instead, their own decision created a problem they couldn't talk, threaten, or outlawyer their way out of. I never raised my voice. I never broke a single rule. I just used the same standard they claimed to operate by and applied it consistently on my own land until the facts made the outcome obvious to everyone watching. That turned out to be more than enough.